IMSC to work, among other things, on traffic models. And he's one of the most, people with the multifarious interests I know of. So he's worked on literally almost everything that our group has ever worked on, from financial markets to, social models to spin models to what have you. But then when he joined our PhD program, he said initially he wanted to work on evolution. And then he went over to this ICTS school on pattern formation in development. And then when he came back, he was a changed man. He said, no, I want to work on pattern formation. And he is the reason why I switched from looking at, abstract Turing models to actual biological models. So Chandrasekhar and Shakti are pretty much the people who kind of dragged me against almost my will into this whole area, and the reason why we are having this workshop in the first place. So Chandrasekhar forget the most important thing. So he's right now at Harvard, and that's a joint position, right? Chandrasekhar, Harvard, and
Uh,
somewhere else.
no. It's no, currently with Harvard.
Okay, okay.
Wait a second. You can see my screen, but these are not my
I can see your
slides.
mailbox.
Okay, that's not what I
Yeah,
wanted to show. But
yeah. So and so he's currently, I think he's in his second year, or has finished
just
two.
completed my second year.
Yeah, he's in second year at Harvard, where he's working with experimental lab, because he said he wanted to do experiments for his postdoc, again on developmental biology. So without further ado, let me invite Chandrasekhar to give the first of his two talks.
So, good evening. Thanks for the organizers, Manishita, Shakti, and everyone for giving me this chance. I've been in IMSC long enough to know that no one enjoys the 6 p.m. talk. So, but nonetheless. So let me see if I can. I'll keep it somewhere. Sorry. If there's a way you can get rid of the video, I mean, unless I don't know whether you can see the split screen with my face and the audience. If I can move that. There you go. All right. So the title of the talk is Role of Intercellular Adhesion in Cell Migration, a Cellopods Model. I stuck to the title because this is the title I gave, but you will see that might not be the best representative because of the contents. But nonetheless, this will be like a pedagogical introduction to the Cellopods model. And today, especially, I will get into what goes, the constituents of like Cellopods model. And in the second session, which is tomorrow, I would like to sort of demonstrate its sort of utility in like a couple of contexts where I'll probably dwell into the biology a bit more, at least to set up the model that we will explore tomorrow. But today it will be mostly about understanding the basic constituents of the Cellopods model. There's not so much to cover. The hope is that you get most of it or all of what I'm saying today. So I guess one way for that to happen is that you stop me whenever you want. I don't know whether you can if people don't want to ask questions but like want to just type questions, I guess someone can inform me that there's a question. Otherwise, you can stop me and just like ask me a question at any time. In fact, I urge you to do so. All right, so I'm a postdoc right now. As Shubhra mentioned, the lab is part of organismic and evolutionary biology and the molecular cell biology departments. The lab mostly works on insect evo. But the lab is quite diverse in terms of what people work on and what kind of tool sets they have. it's very interesting to work. I mean, work with people with very different backgrounds and like, it's to interact with experimentalists and probably do some experiments on your own. Just before I get into the topics, I want to mention that, it's true that in IMS, I probably worked on quite a diverse set of problems. One thing that I can say for sure, I can hear my own voice. Okay, not anymore. Is that you'll realize that quite a lot of the problem, quite a lot of those things that you used in different contexts actually have applications elsewhere, or at least helps you a lot to think about other problems. So I guess, or in other words, it's probably a good idea to always attend talks in very diverse topics. All right. Okay. I think over the couple of weeks or like more than a week, you must have seen people talk about various biological developmental problems. But the way we see it, and most of you see it, is that at the heart of it, you start from something like a single cell or like a clump of cells, which have all sort of symmetry in the sense it has all this. It's basically has a spherical symmetry. It's a clump of cell, can be approximated as a sphere of cells. And from there, you go on to create this organism which barely has any symmetries left. Like even take our cells, even our left-right symmetry doesn't exist because not like that a heart is on one side of the body and liver is to the another side of the body, and like there's no complete asymmetry anywhere. So and also what is nice is that this is achieved by very few basic processes. One of them is proliferation. Obviously, when you start with few cells to go on to make trillions of cells, you have to obviously increase the number of cells. That's mostly done through cell division. And you also have differentiation, which is that you start with cells which are pluripotent, who don't really have, who can take up any cell fate to make up cells that are bone cells, neurons and red blood cells, like you name it. There's like hundreds, if not thousands of different cell types. So you have to have a process by which you create this, which is the differentiation. And then you have the migration. You'll realize that, not all cells that are supposed to do a particular job are created where they're supposed to do their job. So which means that you usually have to make them go to the place where they eventually perform their duties, so to speak. And then apoptosis or cell death. You'll realize that much of the shaping, or the morphology, is created by often not, growing, creating cells just to fit a shape that is in the blueprint, so to speak, but rather you create as many and then carve out things. It's more like how a sculptor would work with a stone. You actually remove the excesses to basically bring in a form. So, and also you have to also kill cells that are not fit enough, which have probably some DNA damage or like something that you think is like, the process of just eliminating cells that you think are not viable. You need a process to do that. And cell death is like one way to do this. So these are the basic processes. Of course, it's like, refined versions of each of these. But with a handful of processes that you go from something simple to something extremely elaborate and complex. And I suppose that's, at least for me, one of the main reasons why I find developmental biology very fascinating. And I'm also sure, given where the course is taking place and the audience, you must have heard enough about Turing mechanism, French flag model, clock and wavefront. Like some of the, and this is definitely not an exhaustive list, but these are like some of the major mechanisms by which you break symmetry to form patterns, so to speak. French flag model for that matter, like you amplify like a pre-existing differences. Like, a particular mRNA is deposited only at one side of the embryo, and you make sure that, because of that, when that translates and produces protein, it creates this sort of gradient. And you use that to sort of, cause cell differentiation in such a way that you amplify the pre-existing differences. And this way you sort of, I mean, there is always going to be some, like if you take the fruit fly, which is a model organism that our lab studies a lot, if you take the embryo, because the mother deposits a lot of mRNA from the anterior side, you end up with a lot of asymmetries in deposition of some things, especially they're like not spatially homogeneous in terms of the distribution, in terms of the content the mother deposits, and that is actually what drives a good early part of the development. So French fact model kind of works basically on amplifying these pre-existing differences. And you will also see that something that I did during my PhD with Shakti and Shita, which is that when you consider noise in the gradient, things are quite different because the blue cells are not always next to each other, and the white cells need not always be next to each other, and there might be mixing of blue and white cells and red and white cells, and this is not usually a good news. It's not preferred, and some of our works focused on this, which is to make sure that how do you reduce this possibility of certain different cell fates being formed in the wrong places, and ensure that the boundaries between these different fates are more clear. And so cell addition is something that works a bit later in this specific context to make the boundaries more clean. And that's one among the many things it does. Cell addition is super important. The fact that I assume these cells are contiguous, if in the schematic, they're attached to each other. They're attached to each other already assumes there is something that is adhering them to each other. So most of the times we don't even stop to think about the importance of addition, but you'll realize that that's super important, and it drives a lot of morphogenetic processes, some of which we will probably get into in greater detail tomorrow. This is just a simple schematic diagram where I just want to highlight some of the key things. So one, if you take the first instance is that, so there's something that is very popular in terms of, I don't know whether you must have heard of this. It's called the epithelial to mesenchymal transition or mesenchymal to epithelial transition, where cells go from individual units that are completely capable of migrating on their own to becoming part of a collective where they bind to each other. So in some sense, but the fact that they're bound to each other kind of limits their ability to migrate whether they want. Now they act like part of a collective. And the reverse process also exists, and this is something that has very high relevance to tumor spreading. But then again, everything that you see associated with cancer, you see that in development as well. So it's this is the fundamental processes that happen in cancer and tumor are not very different. And then there's another instance where, if you see, I want to create this tube of blue cells. And if I can basically, in some sense, find a way to make sure only these blue cells like to attach to each other and they want to whereas the yellow cells like to attach to each other, then I can end up creating this, tube of, blue cell. And this is reminiscent of a bunch of processes that happen during development. So in the sense, if you can make certain cells adhere to certain cells, but not to others, that alone is another way to break symmetry and create patterns. And that does happen quite a lot. And in the case of C, if you see, it's what is referred to as the convergence extension. It's a bit more subtle, where you make the cells prefer to attach, let's say, if you create a higher preference for a cell to attach their apical basal side to each other rather than on the sides, then you can basically change the shape of the tissue itself. And D refers to something that we mentioned before, which is about fine-tuning the boundary. In the case of E, just showing that addition is also important in how you establish the synaptic junctions, which is super important for neurons to communicate with each other. And F is another case, which is a classic case in Drosophila of migrating cells and what is the relevance of migration there. And this is a problem that I will actually talk about a bit tomorrow in detail, so I'll come to that. So this is just one slide, I guess, propaganda for like why cell addition is important. And um, and very often we refer to, when we talk about cells adhering to each other, we refer to cadherins as the major molecules. And there are very different types of cadherins, like E-cadherin, where E stands for epithelial cadherin. And epithelial, since epithelial cell is such a common tissue, cell type, E-cadherin is often talked about. Then there is the N-cadherin, which is the neural cadherin, Sp cadherin, R cadherin, V cadherin, and the number of cadherins keeps only increasing. But this is just essentially all we are referring to is a bunch of molecules that are on the surface of the cells, and they like to adhere to each other. And two cells that basically express the same kind of cadherin have a tendency to stick to each other. And that's all we need to know as far as cell Laporte model is concerned. All right. A bit of history. So how did this cell Laporte model come about? So there's this process of cell sorting. If you see here, the darker cells tend to aggregate each other. You go from a state where the light cell, there's a good mixture of like light and darker cells, but with time, you see these domains of like, darker cells and like lighter cells emerge. And this is a process, as you can see, has great benefit if you were to go back to the old context of the French flag model. Like, if I end up making like blue cells where the white cells are supposed to be, or the other way around, as long as I can say that there is a process that sort of makes blue cells stick to each other and white cells stick to each other, preferentially, then I can actually clean up the boundary in some sense. That's what you call as the, refining the boundary through something, what is called as cell sorting. So they're getting sorted based on the cell type. So the implicit assumption is that cell types of certain kind like to bind to each other. So here in this case, the light cells like to bind to light cells, and the darker cells like to bind to the darker cells. So and this can lead to some sort of sorting. It's too obvious right now when you look at this, look at the simulations on the right side, but this was initially just a hypothesis and people had not tested this. And in 1992, Graner and Glazier, two physicists who basically said, okay, let's just sort of computationally test this hypothesis, whether this can, just having different affinity for their own kind, can that lead to cell sorting? So they wanted to test that. And then they came up with this cell Laporte model. And it was inspired by the Q-state spot model, which I'm sure the audience are more aware of. But it's inspired by that, but that's pretty much where it ends, because a lot of the assumptions, and later on, of course, you'll see the similarities, and the similarities are probably easy for you to notice because you probably are aware of it. Okay, so let's see how this works in some sense. What are the basic assumptions? So here I'm not going to refer to as lattice side. The literature, in the field, people often refer to this as pixels. And I think it's easier to talk about pixels. So each of these lattice point, what people are referred to as lattice point, is what I will refer to as pixels, because that's what people call it. So in essence, every biological cell is represented as a spatially contiguous collection of pixels, which is an assumption that makes sense, because you don't need to know much biology to know that a cell is usually spatial. Cell is spatially contiguous. It's very weird to think of a cell that has two parts that are disconnected. So that's a basic assumption. So in other words, the fancy way to say that you should be able to go from every pixel to the other pixel. There should be a path. So that's the first assumption. And you always assume this, that, like on the right-hand side, you can see that there are I have shown 5 cells there. And they're in this background, which I have, where every pixel has been marked by 0. That's the medium. Or in some context, you can refer to as the extracellular matrix, or wherever the cells exist in some sense. That's the space where the cells exist. Okay. And you will notice that in the framework, you will consider this medium on which the cells exist also as just another cell. But that cell, or the medium, doesn't have the spatially contiguous constraint, because it's kind of obvious as to why You don't need that requirement for that. Okay. What do? The interesting things happen in the boundary, which I've sort of highlighted for all the cells. Because boundaries are essentially where the pixels belonging to a particular cell are in contact with a pixel that belongs to other cells. It could be the pixel that belongs to the medium. So and these interactions, pairwise interactions, have an energy cost associated with it. Okay. And the simulation works by asking, if I take a particular pixel and ask, what are my neighbors? What are the states of my neighbors? And if I see that there's a pixel belonging to some other state, then I ask, if this pixel flips and takes up the state of its neighbor, what is the change in energy? I haven't got into the equation for energy, but let's say there's a function that computes energy for these two states. A state before this pixel has taken up its or imitated its neighbor's state, and the energy before it has done that. So as long as you can compute the energy difference, then if the energy goes down, then you basically accept that flip. If not, then you accept it by the probability p flip, which again was formed, which I'm sure you are familiar with, and I will probably show it, and I will definitely show it in the upcoming slides. Okay, but again, the only another additional constraint is that you have to make sure that after the pixel flip, no cell has been broken into spatially non-contiguous parts. As long as these things are met, that pixel flip is accepted. Now, does anyone have any questions till now? All right. Now that I mentioned that, the simulation works by asking, does the energy change? What is the energy change when I actually accept it, when I perform a particular pixel flip? So in order to do so, one has to define an energy function. The most common energy function would involve these two terms. Let me explain the leftmost term, the first term. So that's a key term which takes into account the pairwise energy cost for pixels belonging to two different cells. So if sigma I and sigma j represent the cell ID of the cells, like for example, if there are five, since there are 5 cells here, I can give them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is the sigma values for each cell. But the energy is not dependent on that, but energy is rather dependent on the cell type. So that is the tau of sigma and tau of sigma. So the cell type of the cells are tau of sigma I and tau of sigma j. So here, even though there are 5 cells, I've named them like 2 and 1 because I've chosen to label the pixels belonging to these cells by their cell type, and also accordingly I've colored them. Now, as you can see here, I have shown the boundary between pixels of cell type 1 by green, just to indicate that the energy cost associated with 2 pixels belonging to a particular cell type 1 could be very different from the energy cost between a pixel belonging to 1 and 2, which I've shown in red, and 2 and 2, which is shown in magenta. And again, the energy cost associated with the cell type 2 interacting with the medium shown in yellow could be different from the energy cost associated with cell type 1 interacting with the medium shown in blue. So as you can see, the energy cost can be represented in the matrix, which is symmetric, and as number of which is k cross k, where k is the number of cell types, including the medium as a particular cell type. So as long as someone gives me that, then I know the cost associated with all the what is the energy cost for the cells to be interacting of that particular system, of the particular state. As you'll see, like the same way you do it in icing, when you do icing model simulations and so on, you never have to actually calculate the energy of the whole system, whole state, but rather you want to calculate the energy difference before the flip and after the flip. Similarly, you use this thing to do the same. Okay, but I haven't mentioned the second term. What is the second term? What does that mean? The second term is often referred to as the volume constraint. And what does a volume constraint mean? As you can imagine, if I take a cell and every pixel at the boundary is interacting with a cell that is of different kind, and if I want to minimize the energy of the whole system, I can do so by minimizing the number of pixels who are at the boundary. But the trouble is, you can do so by actually shrinking the cell. Because the number of that, if you shrink this whole cell, the number of pixels that belong to a cell, then you shrink the number of cells that are at the boundary as well, thereby reducing the system's energy. And that is not something that you want. Cells don't just change volumes like that. So you put a constraint saying that, look, there is a particular V naught for a particular cell. And it would like to, my bad here, it should be V of sigma I, and there's a bracket closing that. So there's a cost associated with varying for the volume to change further away from that V naught value both ways. That's why it's quadratic term, like either you shrink or you expand further away from V naught, there's a cost associated with that. And if you don't have that cost, then it's basically lambda V equal to 0. I don't want to show you a simulation of lambda V equal to 0 because it's too quick. The cell shrinks really fast. Won't be so much of a spectacle. So here I have made it very small enough that you can see the shrinking process. And as you can see, that's not very good news, because this is not what you mean when you say, I want the system to evolve towards energy, a state where the energy is reduced. So instead you basically add this constraint and add lambda V, which is value like 1 or like something respectable, because these things you have to like work it out as to what would be a good value. And then we'll see like with lambda V equal to 1, for example, here, I don't see that happen. The cell sort of wiggles around, but the number of pixels that belong to the cell largely remains constant. Okay. So I didn't tell you what is a p-flip, which is not very surprising because this has the same form as icing or any simulations that you have worked with, where you calculate the energy difference, and you know this term for p-flip, which is when the energy difference is negative. It's going to be you flip a coin, and if it's less than that, you basically accept it. And when it's negative, you're always going to satisfy this criteria, so you'll always accept it. But when the energy difference is actually positive, which means the energy of the system increases after the flip, then you accept it with a certain probability, which increases as you increase the temperature. So makes the system more noisy. It is less. When the temperature is higher, it's more likely to accept pixel flips that increase the state of the system. Energy of the system. So let me show you on the left, I have t is equal to 10. Okay, my bad. That's the wrong chronology of how I should be playing the video. Yeah. So this is at t is equal to 10. You can see it just wiggles around, but largely maintains its shape. And I didn't force them to be circular or close to be a circle, but as you can imagine why that is the case, because that's a shape that minimizes the number of pixels at the boundary, overall minimizing the system's energy. So it tends to take up that shape. To the contrary, if I take temperature to be much higher, at t is equal to 100, you can see that the cell deforms a lot more. because a lot more of the flips that increase the energy of the system are accepted right now. And that leads to this. So that's the role the temperature plays. And it's pretty convenient to have this parameter, tune this parameter, because is one easy way to incorporate, like, how dynamic are the cell shapes when you're modeling certain thing and so on. Assuming there are no questions. If there are any, please ask. Okay.
So, Chandrasekhar,
Yeah,
I have a question. So,
please.
with this model, can you also sort of show formation of, let us say, protrusions like filopodia or lamellipodia, whatever they call that, constraining the volume? Can you do this with cellular pots model, you think?
Okay, it's a good question because people try and do this. That's actually one of the harder things to do. And tomorrow I will actually dwell a bit on how to get these weird shapes, because as you can see, the fact that I have an extended object, protrusions or so on, that just simply increases the number of pixels at the boundary, and it's not energetically favorable unless I make changes to the energy function that favors these, or at least doesn't put a cost as. I mean, if I simply go by like minimizing energy, you just want to minimize the number of pixels at the boundary, and Philopodia definitely doesn't do that. It actually makes the energy of the cell go up. The way to do it, I mean, don't want to like jump the gun, but way to do it is basically you have to break down the cell into multiple compartments. Right now, I'm dealing with like every cell as a single compartment. But to do something like Philopodia, I have to break it into multiple compartments, where Philopodia would be like another compartment, and that has constraints that are very different from the bulk of the cell and so on. So you have to like, break the cell into multiple compartments. It's not a bad thing to do, because to be fair, if I want to include a new cell nucleus, then again, I have to include a different compartment and so on. So if you want to say that different parts of my cell have different mechanical properties, you have to include compartments, because you can't apply the same constraint for the whole cell. So that's how we go about doing it. Yeah.
I see.
I
So
haven't given you the mechanical details of it, but by simple means you can't do that.
I see. Okay, thanks.
No problem. All right. So, okay. There are so many other constraints that, as long as the only limitation for what kind of constraints that should go into the energy equation is the context in which you're working with, and as long as it makes sense to you and you can justify it to an extent, you can include it. For example, something that I use a lot, and a lot of people use it a lot, which is the surface constraint. So like, or in other words, in 2-dimension, it becomes the perimeter constraint. Sometimes cells do take up weird shapes, and you don't want that. When let's say you want it to be more circular, want to hold on to that more circular shape, then you can explicitly put a constraint saying that, look, my S0 is closer to what a circle has, and I don't want the pixels at the boundary, number of pixels at the boundary, to increase further away from that. Sometimes I can say that I have a length constraint. I want the cell to sort of adhere to a certain length. Okay, as long as if I measure the major axis of my cell, and I say that I want it to stick to that value, then I can impose that as an explicit constraint, as long as you have a way to keep track of the length of the cell. Sometimes you can say, okay, no, I want its length along the x-axis to be of a certain length and not change. Okay, as long as you can compute it, you can always put a quadratic term sort of holds them there. So it's up to you, and depends on and this again allows you to sort of achieve certain shapes, but this has very severe limitations, because I can use S0 that corresponds to a circle for the given number of pixels, and keep the cell more circular, because the energy minimizing shape is actually unique. Whereas if the S naught is not that, and if I increase that, there is no guarantee, because there is multitudes of shade that can give you the same value of perimeter. So there's no guarantee that you get the shape you have in mind. So, well, I mean, as you can see, I mean, but you can cleverly think of some way. Some people can you can always come up with a constraint of, I want the ratio of the X, length along the X and Y to maintain a certain value. And then you can impose a constraint based on that. So you can achieve certain cell shapes using that. But these things will not get you something like Philopodia, which need more drastic changes. But by and large, a lot of the phenomena cells look like, it's not a bad approximation to work with more circular, like in a polygonal cell. So in that case, you're good. But of course, when you have like cytonemes, or if you want to have this Philopodia and so on, things get more complex. But this is just to say that you can add as many terms as you want in an energy equation, as long as you can justify it, or as long as it makes sense to you. Okay. I started off by saying that there are a bunch of basic processes in developmental biology, which goes from basic, a clump of cells to something more complex. So far, so let's see if under this framework, how do we get all these things? Because the framework has been extended from the time when Grand and Glazier just wanted to get like the cell sorting to incorporate as many things as possible so that you can use it on broad set of problems. Cell growth, if you think about it, can be kind of easily achieved by making the V naught, the volume, the steady state volume in some sense, a function of time. You can make it increase with time. So I say at t plus 1, the steady state volume for a particular cell just increases by a delta V. Okay. And as long as I do that, you can totally see a cell increase because it has to add more pixels in order to satisfy that criteria and minimize the energy state. And that's how you make a cell grow. So the growth is pretty easy. If you can do growth, you can also shrink the cell, or in other words, you can kill the cell. If you assume that cell death as basically processed by you shrink the cell, maybe at a more rapid rate. Just to make it more dramatic, in this case, I've taken the dV to be negative and actually minus 10. So you'll see this big cell actually shrink to nothing very quickly. So cell growth and cell death are pretty easy to achieve. All you have to do is to basically tinker with the V naught and make it a function of time. And in any case, you can, if you want to cell death, you can just abruptly set the V naught to 0. But it takes a certain number of flips for it to basically reach that state anyway. Because there is no, at every flip, you can't just change the state of more than one pixel. So okay, so it's pretty easy to do cell growth and cell death. How about cell division? Cell division, again, is not that hard. You can say that once a cell grows and reaches a certain volume, or in other words, number of pixels, you take an axis along which the cell just splits into two, and you can decide how much of the volume should go between the daughters. In most cases, if it's in symmetric division, you just give both equal amounts. And also you can decide the cell division axis. So I'm showing on the left like a simulation where the division is along a random axis. So here all I'm saying is, you reach a particular threshold volume, divide. And then the daughters, once they reach that same volume, they divide. Not very surprisingly, you can just fill up the box. If you want to see, like if I want to do it along minor axis, it makes more sense because, it seems like in many divisions, this is actually a better approximation where you divide along or divide perpendicular to the long axis of the cell in some sense.
Chandrasekhar, I have a question.
Yes.
So in this case, are you increasing V naught and then fixing it at some point, or is V naught already high?
So the thing is, as you can see, when a V naught, let's say I say there's a V naught dagger at which the cell divides, okay? And then I'm just saying the new daughter cells now have V naught dagger by 2, right? If it was a symmetric division, the daughter cells are going to be V naught dagger by 2.
Okay.
And then again, those daughter cells, once they reach V naught dagger, they're going to divide. But if anything demands anything in your process, if you see a biological process where initially the cells actually double their volume and then divide, but with time they actually start dividing before they reach double the volume and so on, then you can actually do that. You can basically keep changing the V naught in the V naught dagger or the threshold for cell division itself with time.
So in this case, your
As I said,
V naught dagger.
doesn't change. I've kept like the most basic assumption here. Like these are symmetric divisions. The daughters have been given equal, same, equal share of the volume. Nothing strange is happening here. But you can do that. Nothing stops you from doing that.
Okay.
The only thing is like, as long as you can justify it. Okay. I think the slightly trickier, but I think a very elegant way of elegant thing is how the cell migration was implemented. This is thanks to Pauline Hogeweg. So this model, the Cellopods model I must mention, is also sometimes referred to as the GGH model, where it's the Graner, Glazier, and the Hogeweg, because Pauline Hogeweg later on was instrumental in expanding this framework to include quite a lot of things. And it's pretty cool as to how chemotaxis has been implemented. I agree this is not the only way cells migrate, but chemotaxis seems to be the dominant way. And first time I saw the solution, I found it very elegant. All you do is you assume there's a space in which the cells exist. Parallel to it, you also assume another space where there's a concentration of certain chemical. That is a C. Okay. And if I haven't shown you this, but like if you, I haven't proven this, but if you look at the cells, these perform random walk in space. If you take the center of the cell, it just performs a random walk. So as such, they don't really have a preferred direction of movement because they perform, but you can bias these movements by saying that, I bias, pixel flips in one particular direction. And that's one way to basically make the cells move. So like if on the left, I've shown a schematic where how exactly cell, chemotaxis is implemented. So if you think about the nitty-gritty details of how exactly a cell moves, it's kind of weird. But this is a model anyway. So a cell actually moves to the right by due to conversion of more and more medium cells into the cell. The pixels that belong to the medium on the right should now get converted to the cell, the state of the cell. And on the left side on the trailing side of the cell, you should have the other way around, which is that more pixels that belong to the cell get converted into the medium state. In some sense, it's like it works by like converting the pixel states. So if you assume a underlying chemical field to make the cell move towards the right, let's say. So if I mark this blue pixel as the pixel that belongs to the medium, and the chemical concentration at that value, I prime J prime at that place is C I prime J prime. And one of its neighbor happens to be a cell that, pixel that belongs to the cell, and its concentration is Cij. And now I say, okay, there you go. There is this additional delta E term that I had, which is given by this form, which means when I prime J prime is greater, this is going to be negative. So which will decrease the energy difference, making it more favorable. So it biases the movement in one direction. And as a consequence, the cell moves towards the direction where the Cij, where the C value is increasing. Here I have taken a radial field, and on the right, you'll see that a cell that is basically moving in this direction. because radially outward, the concentration of the chemical field is increasing. So these, those pixel flips are like basically favored. So if you don't do anything, they just perform a random walk in space. All you do is you just create a bias in the direction of this thing, and that will just give you chemotaxis. You can make it more complex, more sophisticated by like, which some of the things I'll basically mention tomorrow, where you can make a certain cell type secrete something, and then you can make a certain cell basically chase that thing and whatnot. You can make this as complex as you want. So this is how you achieve chemotaxis. So far, I've shown you how we can basically a cell division, cell growth, cell death, migration. Differentiation is something that it's a more rule-based. You have to basically explicitly assume if the gradient or some other thing to assume that. So very often in Cellopods model, you start with multiple cell types. In some sense, you assumed the cells are differentiated.
We actually know that in case of a migrating cell, so the shape of the cell will also change. But in this case, that is not happening. So why is that?
No, okay. The answer to the question is I can definitely, if I make my mu very strong, you do see a significant change in the cell shape. It's about the pace at which the cells move. So for example, okay, let me make this argument. So tomorrow I'll make it a point to show some simulation where you can see the change in cell shape as you move. It's a good point. So if the movement of the cell is slow or comparable to the same level where the cell has enough time to also satisfy the constraint that is placed on the number of pixels at the boundary to minimize that. Because if you deviate much away from the circular shape, then you know that you're paying that extra energy cost because of having more pixels at the boundary. But if the pressure for it to move in a particular direction is so fast, then that dictates over basically trying to minimize the number of pixels at the boundary. That will lead to certain significant change in the cell shape. Here, the mu is not so strong that it can actually move along the direction, but also by not changing its shape so much from the circular thing. That is just a question of like how strong is the pull. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
But I will demonstrate this. I mean, that's a very good point. Cells do change their shapes with the pull. Which at least my schematic shows that, but I agree, but schematic I drew it, so not a very strong argument. But I will show, hopefully in some simulation it's more apparent tomorrow. Okay, just coming back to the original question of this sorting. What exactly, I showed you this in the simulation long back as to where the cells sort of sort into this thing. So here I just have like two cell types, A and B. So in the first case, the interaction term, pairwise interaction energy cost is in green and blue, green and green, blue and green, and blue and blue. They're all same. So there's no incentive for them to change their neighbors or anything of that sort, because the energy is going to be the same. And the only thing that dictates the energy is basically number of pixels at the boundary. So you just stay in this state. On the other hand, the energy, if I'm say that, if I have my neighbors, if A has neighbors which are also A, then the energy is minimized there. I mean, it's basically only 2. Whereas when you have a different neighbor than your own cell state, the cell type, the energy cost is much higher. You can see that it leads from this aggregation. Now the question is, if I run this for very, very, very long time, there's a good chance that all the blue cells might actually come together. Because now the one way to look at it is that there's a greater barrier for these isolated blue cells to go through the green cell, because that's energetically not favorable at all. But if you wait long enough, they can perform this very slow random walk and might actually reach there. Or in other words, where I can probably favor this much more is by just having more, increasing the temperature and making more noisy. So I just thereby increasing the chance of these isolated cells also coming together. Or I could have shown this movie for very, very, very long. But then again, these are not very exciting movies to watch. So So I've now shown you all the basic, like in some sense, these are all just the basic constituents of the cell-to-pod model. And using this, there's quite a lot of like diverse set of problems that you can address. And hopefully that's the thing that I'll take like 2 or 3 good, slightly more sophisticated, examples, and I'll show you how we can basically model those things in the tomorrow session. But today was just to show these are the basic constituents. So, thanks for listening. And thanks to my PI, Cassandra Exover, and the members of the Exover Lab. And thanks to James Glazier and his team of people who create CompuCell 3D. Initially, I used to write my own code to simulate all those things, but the timescale from me having an idea to checking if that idea made sense was very long when I wrote my own code. But with this platform, it's much faster. So, which helps a lot because I tremendously increase the pace at which I realize if my idea makes more sense. So, which saves a lot of time. So, and this is a great platform to sort of use. And I urge you all to sort of, explore CompuCell 3D. And I mean, of course, they argue that you should be able to use that platform without knowing the nitty-gritty details of cell-to-pods model. But to be honest, the cell-to-pods model is not such a complicated thing to understand. And hopefully, I will help you all in a bit, at least, in understanding that. And once you have that, it makes sense as to what are all the components in the system, or components in this platform, and how we can use it to basically model very complex problems. Obviously, I'm thanking also the people who provide me money and the lab with money. And I'm happy to take more questions.
Thank you. Questions?
So I have one small query.
Yes?
So in the last case, when we were discussing the cell sorting, what I understood is that the same types of cell, we are assigning them the lesser energy cost, and if the two cells are of different type, then we are assigning them basically higher energy. So like how are we deciding that what would be the difference between the cost of both kind of cells? So basically, yeah. So what would be the energy penalty that we will be assigning? On what are the factors that it is basically depending upon?
Okay. So biologically, what's happening? Okay. Biologically, what's the implicit assumption here is this. Okay, and this is not, I'm just sort of making this up. This legitimately happens, which is, so let's say the cell type A expressed a particular kind of cadherin, E cadherin, and cell type B expressed a kind of cadherin called the N cadherin. And all I'm saying is the N cadherin molecules tend to adhere to each other, and E cadherin molecules tend to adhere to each other. As long as you have that, you're just basically created an addition, this sort of differential addition between cells of A and cells of B. And that's all it needs. And that's what is driving it. Okay. So that's a biological justification in what's happening at the level of why you have such an affinity for same type. And okay. How exactly do I go from there to J? There is no simple answer. Because how do I link J? In some sense, can I link J to the number of complexes these adenine molecules makes? If I can make that, then I can have a meaningful interpretation of J. I have a connection between J and that. And that's kind of missing. And you can say, in some sense, you can say that it's proportional to, in some sense, the J is inversely proportional to the number of junctions these two cells can form. And the number of junctions itself is proportional to, in some sense, the minimum of the number of adenine molecules these two cells have. Because of why I say minimum, because one particular cell might have a million of these molecules, and the second cell, which is interacting with, might have only 100. And as you can imagine, the most number of connections you can form is only 100. So you're limited by whichever cell that has a fewer number of these junctions. So if you can establish this connection, which in some sense, CombiCell 3D and all allows you to do, which is to explicitly have concentration of these adenine molecules. There, by that, you can say my J is a function of the concentration of these molecules. And then the number of junctions that form are in some way depend on the concentration of these two things. And my J is a function of the number of complexes that form. You can make this connection. Here, I've just taken smaller numbers that work, but you can make this connection.
Yeah,
Does
thank
it
you.
help?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, hi Chandrasekhar.
Yeah.
Do you also have, is there also a protocol to incorporate signaling and things like that? Like the way you incorporated gradients, for example. You have another layer where signaling and all this is taken care of.
So the thing is, you have to. The answer is, for most of these things, the answer is yes. But I'm going to answer based on, like, does CompuCell 3D allow you to do it easily? That's what I want to say. Because end of the day, if you have some idea, then you know that in principle you can implement all of it. But then it also means that you have to implement a lot of things that already exist on your own, which is not very nice. So one way to do is that you can always say, if it's a contact mediated sort of signaling, let's say, you can always get information as to how many common pixels two cells form. And you can say that overlap is a proxy for the number of, let's say, contacts these two cells have made. And you can say that affects the concentration. Okay, you can model concentration of a particular molecule, which the CompuCell 3D allows for. And you can say this concentration, you can say a cell secretes this and the secretion rate is just proportional to the overlap with its neighbor and this thing. So you can do this. You can, because there's a whole something called the secretion plugin, which allows for a cell to, I'll show you tomorrow, like often, when people want to simulate, let's say, a tumor cell that is being chased by macrophage because the tumor cell is secreting something, then you can say that, look, this tumor cell secretes certain thing, and the macrophage just chemotaxis, moves in the direction of the concentration of this thing that the cell secretes. You can do that. So that's one way to do it. And you can take that variable and say that affects my amount of adenine molecules on the surface and whatnot. So you can build it that way. Yeah.
Okay. Also, is there like some way to have time dependent protocol? Like you get what I mean. I guess the energy terms are sort of time dependent, and will that allow you to sort of regulate how these things move or change their shapes?
So you can do that. I mean, because
CompuCell.
yeah. Because end of the day, there's a lot of Monte Carlo steps. You can change. In fact, it allows for giving your own custom, energy functions and so on. You can say that, and after a particular time, switch to this energy function. Or just if you want to just change a parameter, you can also say after a particular time, do this, and so on.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, you can do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Hello, sir. So actually, my question is, in a slide you had shown how we can model cell division based on increased volume. So if we consider the zygotic cleavage that occurs just after fertilization, in that case, the overall volume actually stays constant, and we have to consider factors like density or mass, which is not possible to incorporate, I think, in 2D model. So how do we model that?
No, actually, cleavage division is pretty easy to model. All you have to do is like a stereotypic cleavage division just keeps reducing the volume by half every round. So all you have to say is the threshold for division in the first round, let's say, is like, I say that cell divides when the cell volume is 100 pixel. Then the next round of cell division, I just say it divides by when it's 50 pixels. And the next division, I say it divides when it's 25 pixel and so on. So yeah, you can do that. You just have to set the bar for the cell to divide the threshold volume for the cell to divide itself change with time and reduce with time for the cleavage formation. Because all your cleavage division is basically cell division without the growth part. So the typical cell division involves this doubling of growth, which might not happen in many contexts. And the cleavage is the extreme case where there is no growth at all. So you can do that.
Thank you, sir.
No problem.
Hey, yeah. So my question is kind of regarding cell division as well. So in the video you showed, it was very interesting to see how the cells divided and then they grew. Now, you also mentioned, if I got it right, that there was some cost, energy cost associated with a change of volume. So if del V is, greater than zero, less than zeros, there is some sort of a cost, and that's how that's something which you use to regulate cell shape, if I got it right. So this del V is dependent on the change in volume between two different, times, right? So for example, there is two different time points. So I want to know how exactly is that what plays a role in the growth of cells during cell division? How exactly do the cells divide and then reach a size which is similar to the previous before the cell division?
So let's say my V naught. So if my current volume of a particular cell is like 50 pixel and my V naught has been set to 100, let's say. So that's going to be a difference of 50 square.
Right.
That's 2500 into lambda V. That's a huge energy cost.
Okay.
And the way to make that energy cost zero is by increasing my volume to basically V naught. Okay. And that's a trick that I'm playing when I say increase the growth cell. All I'm saying is with time, I'm just adding more and more value, that delta V to V naught. So there's a constant pressure for the cell to sort of reduce the energy, which means the only way it reduces energy is by just keeping up its volume with the V naught, and that's you keep growing. That's how we do it. Yeah, it's just because I know that the cell has a tendency to sort of just match that value, because that's one way to make the energy zero, at least that term zero. So it just catches up. It just keeps doing that. Yeah. And to be fair, in the simple case here, I was in the delta V is the same at every time step. That's probably not true, because you know that the volume of the cell actually kind of doesn't grow linearly, but sometimes it actually saturates after a particular point. So that you can totally incorporate. You can say that my delta V itself is a function of time. I made V not a function of time. You can make a delta V itself as a function of time, where in the beginning, you add more values of delta V, but after time, it's sort of the delta V you keep adding is also slow. You can do that. That's one way to make a non-linear growth of cells if you want. But all it's doing is, it's a simple trick. If you don't, if the cell is being forced to take the volume that is V naught, which is increasing. If it doesn't follow up with V naught, there is a huge energy cost. So it forgets about everything else and makes sure that it first reaches that volume.
Cool. Thank you.
No problem.
Hi. So I just had a question. I was just wondering. So you showed some movies where you would increase the temperature and the boundary of the cell was quite fuzzy and it was sort of changing a lot. But I think that was when you just had the constraint on the volume, right? You didn't have any other constraints, right? So I'm just wondering. Suppose you had some additional constraints, which in some sense you could increase the rigidity, like for example, maybe either through the surface area or the leather. I don't know how you do that, but you'd have some constraint on that. And now you increase the temperature. Would you find that like the cell sort of maintains its shape a bit and moves around a lot more? I'm just curious. I mean, I wonder what would you see in such a case?
So the moment I put a surface constraint, so no, very good point. To be fair, I actually had a video with IRT, but with the surface constraint, which I forgot to add. But which is, it does exactly that, what you pointed out, which is that it doesn't allow again so much freedom, because now there's an additional constraint, because it's an additional term in the energy function, because whenever it takes up this thing, there's a cost that also comes because you're deviating so much from the surface energy, surface area, or the perimeter in this case. So it tries to basically not go further away from this. And the center of mass itself can only move by the deformations of the boundary. So it does reduce the overall movement as well, because you're making the cell overall very rigid. And in fact, one way, sometimes people want to just build barriers in cellopods model, is barriers that don't do anything. Like, Like you can make a cell go in a maze. The one way to in cell-pods model, make a maze with like these passive cells is to basically set their lambda v to very, very, very high value. If you make the lambda v very, very high value, it there is so much cost for even changing one pixel. Okay, if you see, any movement has to come by altering the volume momentarily away from its v naught. But if you don't allow it to move at all from v naught, then that cell is stuck in space. So, so in some sense, when you make this lambda v or lambda s very, very, very large, it's a limit where you're basically paralyzing that cell in some sense. It just simply can't move.
Thanks.
Yeah. But to be fair, in a CompuCell 3D, they have an easy way to basically get a passive cell. You just say it's a passive cell and it doesn't move.
All right. So if there are no further questions, let's thank Chandrasekhar once more.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Chandrasekhar. So we'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for listening. Yeah. Thanks for the questions. See you
Sure.
tomorrow.
Sure.
Bye.
Bye.